The rocking chair still creaked on the wraparound porch, its runners grinding against weathered oak planks in a rhythm that had lulled Sophronia Blackridge to sleep for the last time. When the sun broke over the Blue Ridge Peaks that August morning in 1803, it illuminated more than morning dew on the porch boards. This is the story of how a single moment of rage shattered the careful order of an Appalachian plantation and birthed a ghost tale that refuses to die. The sound of rushing water over limestone, the sharp bite of wood smoke, the rough-hewn texture of cabin walls. These sensory anchors defined life at Blackridge Hollow, where the Cumberland Gap carved its ancient passage through Virginia's western frontier. Here, in a valley so remote that news from Richmond took 6 weeks to arrive, Sophronia Blackridge ruled her domain with the iron certainty of a woman born to command others. The Blackridge estate sprawled across 1,500 acres of mountain farmland, tobacco fields stretching down to the creek bottom, while apple orchards climbed the lower slopes. 63 enslaved souls worked the land, lived in the quarters, and served in the main house, a 2-story federal-style mansion that Sophronia's late husband Reginald had built to rival anything in Charleston or Savannah. But this wasn't the cultured low country. This was Appalachian wilderness, where isolation bred its own particular cruelties. Margaret had arrived at Blackridge Hollow in the spring of 1800, part of a coffle that included 12 other human beings sold to settle debts in Lynchburg. The auction record, preserved in the Blackridge family papers, lists her simply, Negro woman, age approximately 22, field hand, no visible defects, sold for $300. What the record couldn't capture was the intelligence that flickered behind Margaret's dark eyes, or the way she carried herself with a dignity that no auction block could diminish. Sophronia noticed it immediately, and it rankled her from the very first day. "That one thinks too much," Sophronia confided to her neighbor Clementine Ashbrook during one of their afternoon visits. "Watch her face when I give orders. There's defiance there, mark my words." Clementine, whose own plantation employed similar methods of control, nodded knowingly. "Break that spirit early, or it'll infect the others." My Lucian always said the thinking ones caused the most trouble. Where Reginald Blackridge had relied on the overseer Mortimer Fenridge to manage discipline, Sophronia preferred a more personal approach. She believed that direct, intimate control over every aspect of her enslaved workers' lives created a more efficient system. What it actually created was a powder keg of resentment that had been building pressure for 3 long years. The morning routine at Blackridge Hollow began before dawn. Margaret rose with the others in the quarters, a collection of log cabins that housed the field hands in cramped, airless conditions. Breakfast was cornmeal mush and whatever vegetables they could grow in their small garden plots. Then came the endless labor, tobacco cultivation, harvesting, processing, that generated the wealth flowing back to Sophronia's accounts in Richmond banks. But Margaret's true torment began each afternoon at precisely 2 o'clock, when she was summoned to the main house for what Sophronia called domestic instruction. These sessions took place on the front porch, where Sophronia would settle into her mahogany rocking chair, the one her grandmother had brought from England, and hold court over Margaret's assigned tasks. Mending, cooking, cleaning, all performed under the constant commentary of a woman who found fault with every stitch, every sweep of the broom, every arrangement of her precious china. "Slower with those teacups, girl. That porcelain belonged to my mother, and if you chip so much as a handle, you'll feel the lash." Sophronia's voice carried the particular venom reserved for someone she considered both property and personal affront. The neighbors thought Sophronia's attention to domestic detail was admirable. Verity Ravensley often commented on how well-trained the Blackridge house servants appeared. What they didn't see were the welts on Margaret's back, the result of lessons that grew harsher each week. 3 years of this careful, methodical cruelty had worn Margaret's patience to its thinnest possible edge. But what happens when that edge finally breaks? When a human being, reduced to property, denied every basic dignity, subjected to daily humiliation, reaches the moment where survival itself demands action. The answer came on August 15, 1803, during what would be Sophronia Blackridge's final afternoon in her grandmother's rocking chair. Margaret's hands trembled as she polished the silver tea service, each piece reflecting a fractured version of her face. The August heat pressed down on Blackridge Hollow like a suffocating blanket, but the real weight came from 3 years of accumulated rage, finally reaching its breaking point. When ordinary people are pushed beyond human endurance, the moment of reckoning arrives not with fanfare, but with the terrible quiet of a decision already made. The 15th of August, 1803, began like any other summer day in the Virginia mountains. Roosters crowed from the chicken yard, wood smoke curled from kitchen chimneys, and the distant sound of axes rang through the timber as field hands cleared new acreage for next year's tobacco crop. But in the quarters where Margaret had spent another sleepless night, something fundamental had shifted. "She's different this morning," whispered Josiah Bramblewell to his wife Felicity as they watched Margaret walk past their cabin. Josiah, the plantation's blacksmith, had keen eyes for reading trouble, skills learned from 20 years of bondage. "Look how she holds herself, like she's already decided something." Felicity Dunsmore, who worked in the main house kitchen, felt the change too. Yesterday evening, when Ms. Sophronia made her scrub the porch boards for the 3rd time, Margaret didn't cry. She just stared at that rocking chair, like she was memorizing it. The morning passed in deceptive normalcy. Margaret completed her field duties, chopping tobacco worms from the broad green leaves, a task that required precision and speed under Mortimer Fenridge's watchful eye. The overseer, a weathered man whose leather whip hung from his belt like a third arm, noticed nothing unusual about Margaret's demeanor. At 11:30 that morning, a letter arrived from Richmond that would seal Sophronia's fate, though she couldn't have known it at the time. The correspondence, delivered by a traveling merchant named Alaric Dunsworth, brought news from Sophronia's banker cousin, Marcella Thornbridge. Tobacco prices were climbing due to increased European demand, promising another profitable season for the Blackridge estate. Sophronia read the letter twice, her satisfaction evident in the way she drummed her fingers against the porch railing. 63 head of property, generating this much wealth, she murmured to herself, using the dehumanizing language that plantation owners employed to distance themselves from the moral weight of slavery. Father always said Virginia land was the foundation of proper fortune. What Sophronia failed to grasp was that 63 human beings, not head of property, were listening, watching, and reaching their own conclusions about the source of her wealth. The fatal afternoon session began at exactly 2 o'clock. As always, Sophronia settled into her beloved rocking chair, its mahogany arms worn smooth by decades of use. The chair had become more than furniture. It was the throne from which she dispensed daily humiliation, the symbol of her absolute power over every person who lived and labored at Blackridge Hollow. Margaret approached the porch carrying a basket of mending, torn work shirts, and patched breeches that required careful attention. The summer air hung thick with the scent of honeysuckle and wood smoke, while cicadas droned in the oak trees that shaded the house. "Set that basket down and show me your hands," Sophronia commanded, her voice carrying that particular tone of anticipated displeasure. She had developed a ritual of inspecting Margaret's hands before any domestic work began, claiming that dirty fingernails would soil the fabric. Margaret extended her hands, palms up. They were clean. She had scrubbed them raw in the creek that morning. But Sophronia found fault anyway. Calluses like a field hand. How am I supposed to trust fine needlework to such coarse hands? The criticism was familiar, part of the daily script designed to reinforce hierarchy and break down dignity. Perhaps you need reminder of proper care for your mistress's belongings. The neighbors had never questioned these afternoon sessions. Leonora Whitcomb, whose plantation lay 5 miles down the valley, often praised Sophronia's hands-on approach to managing her domestic staff. That woman knows how to maintain proper order. Leonora would tell her husband Tobias Ravenston. Too many plantation owners leave everything to overseers and wonder why their houses run wild. But what would these neighbors have said if they'd witnessed the systematic cruelty that these sessions actually represented? Would they have intervened? Or would they have found ways to justify what they saw? The afternoon progressed with Sophronia's usual catalog of complaints. Margaret's stitches were too loose, her posture too casual, her pace too slow. Each criticism was accompanied by increasingly personal attacks designed to reinforce Margaret's powerlessness. "Look at me when I speak to you," Sophronia snapped when Margaret kept her eyes focused on the mending. 3 years I've been trying to teach you proper respect, and you still act like some kind of equal person." The words hung in the humid air like a challenge. Some kind of equal person. That phrase, spoken with such casual contempt, would be the last thing Sophronia Blackridge ever said. Because at that moment, something inside Margaret finally, irrevocably broke. But what happens when the foundation of an entire social system rests on one person's willingness to accept their dehumanization? What occurs when that acceptance suddenly, violently ends? The answer was about to write itself in blood across the front porch of Blackridge Hollow, transforming a piece of English mahogany furniture into the centerpiece of an Appalachian legend that would outlive everyone who witnessed it. The woodshed behind the main house held the scent of seasoned oak, the bite of metal tools, and the smooth-worn texture of handles shaped by countless hands. Margaret's fingers closed around the splitting axe at exactly 2:47 that afternoon, its weight both foreign and familiar in her grip. This was the moment when 3 years of systematic dehumanization collided with the simple, terrible fact that every human being has a breaking point. The tool shed stood 30 paces from the front porch, close enough that Margaret could still hear Sophronia's voice droning through another litany of complaints about needlework and posture and the proper deference expected from property. The axe had been used that morning to split kindling for the kitchen fire, its blade sharp enough to bite clean through seasoned hickory. Mortimer Fenridge had left it there, handle propped against the workbench, after completing his morning chores. The overseer's casual negligence with tools would have earned any enslaved person a whipping, but overseers lived by different rules on Virginia plantations. Margaret lifted the axe, testing its balance. 4 pounds of iron head mounted on a straight ash handle, designed for splitting wood but capable of splitting so much more. The weight felt solid, purposeful, like justice might feel if justice had ever existed at Blackridge Hollow. From the porch came Sophronia's voice, pitched higher now with growing irritation. "Don't make me repeat myself, girl. When I speak, you answer, 'Yes, ma'am,' and you mean it. 3 years, and you still haven't learned the simplest courtesies." The words carried clearly through the August air, each one landing like another stone on a scale that had already tipped past any hope of balance. Margaret walked back toward the porch, the axe held low at her side. Her movement was deliberate, measured, like someone who had finally found clarity after years of confusion. The other field hands, working in distant tobacco rows, didn't notice her approach. The house servants were occupied with afternoon duties inside the mansion. Sophronia sat in her rocking chair, completely absorbed in her critique of Margaret's mending work. The afternoon sun slanted across the porch, illuminating the intricate needlework pattern of her day dress, imported silk from Charleston, worth more than most enslaved people would earn in a theoretical lifetime of wages. "This hemming is completely unacceptable," Sophronia continued, holding up a work shirt with obvious disdain. "Look at these stitches. Uneven, sloppy, the work of someone who doesn't take pride in serving her betters." She glanced up, expecting to see Margaret standing meekly beside the mending basket. Instead, she saw a woman approaching with an axe, and for perhaps the first time in her adult life, Sophronia Blackridge understood that her absolute power over another human being was about to end. The recognition flickered across her face like lightning, surprise, then understanding, then terror, as she realized that 3 years of carefully calculated cruelty were about to receive their final payment. "What are you?" Sophronia began, starting to rise from her chair. Margaret raised the axe. "Some debts demand their due." The blow fell with the sound of splitting wood, because that's what it was. The sound of something being broken that could never be repaired. The English mahogany rocking chair, which had survived an ocean voyage and 40 years of Virginia weather, shattered under the impact that ended Sophronia Blackridge's reign of domestic terror. The account ledger, found in Sophronia's desk drawer later that day, contained her final entry, written in her characteristic precise handwriting. Property inventory complete. 63 head valued at $18,400 total. Tobacco yield projected excellent for autumn market. She had been calculating the monetary value of human beings at the very moment one of those human beings decided to recalculate the moral ledger in return. The immediate aftermath brought an eerie silence to Blackridge Hollow. Birds stopped singing in the oak trees. The distant sound of fieldwork continued unchanged. Chopping tools striking earth, voices calling instructions across tobacco rows. But the porch itself became a pocket of absolute quiet. Margaret stood over the wreckage, axe still in her hands, looking at what 3 years of accumulated rage had accomplished in less than 10 seconds. The rocking chair lay in pieces, its mahogany runners split and scattered. Sophronia's needlework basket had overturned, spilling thread and fabric across the porch boards. The English porcelain tea service, which Sophronia had treasured above the lives of the people who served it, lay in fragments among the chair debris. Each broken piece reflected Margaret's face in fractured, distorted angles, as if the very instruments of her oppression were finally showing her the truth they had hidden for so long. But Margaret's moment of liberation carried a price that extended far beyond her own life. In 1803 Virginia, the killing of a white woman by an enslaved person triggered legal machinery designed to ensure that such acts of resistance would serve as warnings rather than inspirations. What Margaret had just purchased with Sophronia's life was not freedom, but a different kind of bondage, one measured in hours rather than years, and ending with a rope rather than old age. Yet, as she stood there among the ruins of her tormentor's throne, something had fundamentally changed in the moral architecture of Blackridge Hollow. The careful system of control that had kept 63 human beings in bondage now had a crack running straight through its foundation. But how long would it take the other inhabitants of the plantation to discover what lay bleeding on their front porch? And what would they do when they realized that the unthinkable had finally, irrevocably occurred? The flies arrived first, drawn by the metallic scent that mingled with spilled tea and honeysuckle blossoms scattered across the blood-stained porch boards. Mortimer Fenridge found them there at 3:20 that afternoon, a black cloud buzzing around what remained of his employer's afternoon routine. The discovery of a murdered plantation mistress in 1803 Virginia would trigger a legal and social response designed to remind every enslaved person exactly what happened to those who dared raise their hands against white authority. The sound of Fenridge's boots pounding against the porch planks, the sharp intake of breath when realization hit, the rough texture of splintered mahogany beneath his knees as he knelt beside the wreckage. These sensory anchors marked the moment when Margaret's act of personal liberation became a community crisis that would consume Blackridge Hollow for months to come. The overseer's first instinct was practical rather than emotional. Fenridge had seen death before, in the fields, in the quarters, in the countless small tragedies that plantation life generated with mechanical regularity. But this death was different. This death would bring questions, investigations, legal proceedings that could threaten his own position if not handled properly. He surveyed the scene with the methodical attention of a man whose survival depended on reading situations correctly. The overturned rocking chair, its English mahogany runners split by what had obviously been an axe blow. The scattered needlework, blood-soaked now and attracting more flies. The fragments of imported porcelain that had once served tea to visiting neighbors who praised Sophronia's refinement, and conspicuously absent from the tableau, the house servant who should have been completing her afternoon duties under Sophronia's supervision. Fenridge's mental calculation was swift and brutally clear. Margaret had been the only person assigned to porch duty that afternoon. The other house servants were accounted for. Felicity Dunsmore in the kitchen, preparing the evening meal. Old Josiah Bramblewell at his forge, repairing hinges for the tobacco barn. The field hands were visible in the distance, still working the crop rows under the supervision of his assistant overseer. That left one person unaccounted for, and Fenridge's 20 years of managing enslaved labor had taught him that unaccounted people were usually guilty people. He stood slowly, wiping his hands on his breeches, and reached for the horn that hung from his belt. The sound that emerged, 3 long wailing blasts, was the plantation's alarm signal, designed to summon every available person for emergencies like runaway slaves or barn fires. The response was immediate. Field hands dropped their tools and began jogging toward the main house. House servants emerged from kitchens and quarters, faces tight with the particular anxiety that came from knowing that someone among them had transgressed beyond forgiveness. Within minutes, 62 people stood in a semicircle around the front porch, staring at evidence of what many had probably fantasized about, but none had dared to attempt. The unthinkable had become reality. Leonora Whitcomb, riding her afternoon constitutional along the creek path that connected neighboring plantations, heard the horn blast and guided her horse toward Blackridge Hollow. As a fellow plantation mistress, she understood that such signals rarely announced good news. What she found when she crested the hill overlooking the main house defied her comprehension. "Mortimer, what in God's name has happened here?" Leonora demanded, dismounting before her horse had fully stopped. Her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to receiving immediate, complete answers. Fenridge gestured toward the porch with one blood-stained hand. "Ms. Sophronia's been murdered, ma'am. Killed with an axe while she sat in her rocking chair. And we know who did it." The assembled crowd of enslaved people remained silent, but Leonora could read the tension in their postures, the way they avoided looking directly at the carnage while remaining hyper-aware of every word spoken by the 2 white authority figures. A plantation inventory conducted the previous month had listed Margaret as house servant, skilled in domestic arts, valued at $400. But no inventory could capture the 3 years of accumulated grievances that had finally exploded into violence, or the way that explosion now threatened to destabilize the entire social order that kept 62 other human beings in bondage. Felicity Dunsmore, who had worked alongside Margaret in the main house, found her voice first. "Ms. Whitcomb, ma'am. Margaret ain't been seen since this afternoon's domestic instruction began. Usually, she comes back to the kitchen when Ms. Sophronia finishes with her. But today, the unfinished sentence hung in the humid air like an accusation. Tobias Ravenston arrived 20 minutes later, summoned by a rider Leonora had dispatched to his plantation. As the closest thing to a magistrate in this remote corner of Virginia, Tobias would be responsible for organizing the legal response to what everyone now understood had occurred. His examination of the scene was brief but thorough. The angle of the axe blow, the position of the body, the absence of any sign that Sophronia had struggled or attempted to flee, all pointed to an attack that had been sudden, decisive, and personal. "This wasn't robbery," Tobias announced to the assembled crowd. "Nothing's missing from the house. This was deliberate murder, carried out by someone who had specific grievance against the deceased." The legal machinery of 1803 Virginia contained specific provisions for such cases. The killing of a white person by an enslaved person was not merely murder, it was insurrection, a crime against the entire social order that required swift, public punishment to prevent similar acts of resistance. But first, they had to find Margaret. The search began immediately. organized with a methodical efficiency that plantation owners applied to all aspects of controlling human property. Dogs were summoned from neighboring estates. The creek was dragged. Every cabin in the quarters was searched. Every possible hiding place examined. By sunset, they had found nothing. Margaret had simply vanished into the Virginia wilderness, carrying with her the knowledge that 62 other enslaved people had watched her disappear without raising an alarm or offering assistance to her pursuers. What did that silence mean? Was it fear or something more dangerous? Solidarity with someone who had finally acted on feelings they all shared but had never dared express. The answer to that question would determine not just Margaret's fate, but the future of every person who lived and labored at Blackridge Hollow. The bloodhounds bayed through the mountain hollows, their voices echoing off limestone cliffs while torchlight flickered between black oak trunks. By midnight on August 15th, 23 white men from 5 plantations had joined the search for a woman who had vanished as completely as morning mist. The hunt for Margaret would expose something more dangerous than one enslaved person's act of rebellion. It would reveal how fragile the entire system of control actually was when tested by coordinated resistance. The night air carried the scent of pine smoke from dozens of torches, the metallic taste of approaching rain, and the rough texture of rope coiled around saddle horns as the search party spread through the Blue Ridge foothills. These men understood that they weren't just hunting one fugitive. They were defending a social order that depended on absolute submission from hundreds of human beings who outnumbered their masters 3-1 in this remote corner of Virginia. Tobias Ravenston had organized the search with military precision, dividing the mountainous terrain into sectors and assigning teams to cover every possible escape route. The dogs, borrowed from neighboring plantations where they were normally used to track runaway slaves, strained against their leashes as they followed scent trails that seemed to vanish and reappear without logical pattern. "She's got help," declared Alaric Dunsworth, the merchant who had delivered Sophronia's final letter that morning. "No field hand disappears this clean without someone covering her tracks." The accusation hung in the humid air, like an unspoken threat to every enslaved person within hearing distance. But the search teams were discovering something that challenged their assumptions about the docility and isolation of their human property. At the Morrison plantation, 2 bloodhounds lost Margaret's scent at the edge of a creek, only to pick it up again 3 miles downstream, a distance that suggested someone had provided a boat or raft for crossing. At the Ashbrook estate, searchers found evidence of a recently used campsite with supplies that no runaway slave should have possessed: salt, pork, cornbread, even a woolen blanket. Most troubling of all, none of the enslaved people questioned by the search parties claimed to have seen anything unusual. Their responses were uniformly polite, helpful, and completely uninformative. Clementine Ashbrook, whose own plantation lay directly along one of Margaret's probable escape routes, grew increasingly suspicious as the night wore on. "My house servants are lying," she confided to Leonora Whitcomb during a brief rest at the Ashbrook Manor. "They know something, but they're protecting her." Leonora nodded grimly. "The same at my place. 20 years I've owned some of these people, and tonight they look at me like strangers." The 2 women were witnessing something that plantation owners had always feared but rarely acknowledged: the possibility that their enslaved workers might possess their own communication networks, their own systems of mutual aid, their own capacity for organized resistance. At 2:30 in the morning, the search party following the creek bottom made a discovery that transformed their understanding of what they were facing. Hidden beneath a fallen log, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay a bundle containing dried meat, cornmeal, and a hand-drawn map showing safe houses and creek crossings extending all the way to the Ohio River. The Underground Railroad had tentacles reaching into Virginia's most remote hollows. The map's existence suggested that Margaret's escape wasn't spontaneous desperation, but part of a coordinated network that had been operating under their noses for months or years. The careful markings indicated safe houses, sympathetic contacts, and river crossings, a systematic infrastructure for moving enslaved people toward freedom. Mortimer Fenridge examined the map by torchlight, his weathered face growing grimmer with each detail he absorbed. "This shows routes through 6 counties," he muttered. "Takes organization, takes people willing to risk everything to help runaways." The implications were staggering. If such networks existed, if enslaved people had been successfully coordinating resistance activities without detection, then the entire foundation of plantation security was built on illusion rather than reality. Tobias Ravenston called off the search at dawn, but not because they had found Margaret. The dogs had lost her trail completely somewhere near the Cumberland Gap, where the mountains offered countless hiding places, and the state border provided legal complications for any pursuit. More importantly, the searchers had begun to realize that continuing the hunt might reveal more about the scope of resistance networks than they were prepared to confront. The ride back to Blackridge Hollow occurred in tense silence. Each plantation owner was calculating how many of his own enslaved people might be connected to the underground networks that had spirited Margaret away so efficiently. Each overseer was wondering how many escape attempts had succeeded without his knowledge, attributed to drowning or wild animal attacks rather than coordinated resistance. By sunrise on August 16th, the immediate hunt for Margaret had failed, but it had succeeded in exposing something far more threatening to the plantation system than one woman's act of revenge. The 62 enslaved people still living at Blackridge Hollow went about their morning chores with studied normalcy, but their white overseers noticed subtle changes. Conversations that stopped when white people approached, glances exchanged across work crews, a collective wariness that suggested everyone knew more than they were admitting. Sophronia Blackridge's murder had been intended as a personal settling of accounts, but it had inadvertently pulled back the curtain on a resistance network that extended far beyond one plantation's boundaries. The question now wasn't whether Margaret would be captured. It was whether the other enslaved people at Blackridge Hollow would continue pretending to be ignorant of the systems that had helped her escape. And what would happen to those 62 people if their white masters decided that ignorance was no longer a believable defense? The whipping post behind the quarters stood silent in the pre-dawn darkness, its weathered oak surface scarred by years of plantation discipline. By August 17th, that silence would be broken by screams that carried across the hollow, like a warning to anyone who might harbor thoughts of resistance. When traditional methods of control fail, those in power often resort to tactics designed to remind the oppressed exactly what happens when authority is challenged, even by association. The sound of chains rattling against iron shackles, the acrid smell of fear sweat in the cramped quarters, the rough texture of rope burns on wrists. These anchors mark the beginning of Mortimer Fenridge's systematic interrogation of every enslaved person remaining at Blackridge Hollow. The overseer had spent the morning after Margaret's escape reviewing plantation records, searching for any connection that might explain how a field hand had vanished so completely. What he discovered in Sophronia's meticulous account books was a pattern of small infractions and punishments that painted Margaret not as an isolated malcontent, but as part of a broader network of resistance that had been operating beneath the surface for months. "Look at these entries," Fenridge muttered to Tobias Ravenston as they stood in Sophronia's former office. Margaret was caught talking to Josiah Bramblewell after evening prayers 6 times this year. Felicity Dunsmore was punished for sharing food with Margaret's work crew. And here, old Samuel from the Creek Bottom quarters was found with papers he claimed were Bible verses, but nobody taught him to read. The implications were clear to both men. Margaret's escape hadn't been the desperate flight of an individual. It had been facilitated by a network of mutual aid that extended throughout the plantation's enslaved community. Ravenston's response was swift and brutal. Bring them all to the whipping post. Start with the ones who worked closest to Margaret. Keep asking questions until someone tells us who helped her disappear. The first interrogation began at 8 o'clock that morning with Josiah Bramblewell, the blacksmith whose forge work gave him mobility around the plantation grounds. Fenridge's questions were direct. Who had Margaret spoken to on the day of the murder? Where had she gotten the map found near the creek? Which of the house servants knew about escape routes to the Ohio River? Josiah's answers were consistent with those of every enslaved person questioned. He knew nothing, had seen nothing, had heard nothing unusual. Each denial was punctuated by the whistle of leather against flesh. Truth has many prices in Virginia. Felicity Dunsmore was brought to the post at noon, after Josiah had been carried unconscious back to the quarters. Her interrogation followed the same pattern. Questions about Margaret's associates, about suspicious conversations, about anyone who might have provided assistance to a murderous runaway. Felicity maintained her ignorance through 20 lashes, her voice growing weaker, but her story remaining unchanged. She had worked alongside Margaret in the kitchen, nothing more. By afternoon, a crowd had gathered to witness the interrogations. Neighboring plantation owners like Clementine Ashbrook and Leonora Whitcomb arrived with their own overseers, ostensibly to offer support, but actually to observe Fenridge's techniques for extracting information from resistant enslaved populations. You have to break them systematically, Fenridge explained to his audience between sessions. Start with the ones most likely to know something. Increase the pressure until someone decides that loyalty isn't worth permanent injury. But as the day wore on, something unexpected emerged from the interrogations. Despite hours of physical punishment, despite threats of sale to Deep South cotton plantations, despite promises of reduced sentences for cooperation, none of the 62 remaining enslaved people at Blackridge Hollow provided any useful information about Margaret's escape. Their silence wasn't the silence of ignorance. It was the silence of coordinated resistance. Old Samuel, the creek bottom field hand who supposedly couldn't read, was brought to the post at 4 o'clock that afternoon. At 63, he was among the oldest enslaved people on the plantation, someone who had survived 4 decades of bondage through careful submission to white authority. Yet when Fenridge demanded to know about the papers found in Samuel's cabin, the old man's response surprised everyone. Them papers? That's Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. Been carrying those words since I was a boy, 'cause they remind me that even in the valley of the shadow of death, fear ain't got to rule over you. The biblical quotation, delivered with quiet dignity despite the shackles around Samuel's wrists, seemed to strike the assembled crowd like a physical blow. Here was a man who had spent his entire adult life as property, quoting scripture about walking through valleys of death without fear. Fenridge raised his whip, but Tobias Ravenston held up a restraining hand. Something in Samuel's demeanor suggested that further punishment would accomplish nothing except to confirm what was already becoming obvious. The enslaved community at Blackridge Hollow had made a collective decision to protect Margaret's memory and anyone who might have aided her escape. As sunset approached on August 17th, the interrogations had produced dozens of lash marks, but zero actionable intelligence. More importantly, they had demonstrated something that terrified every plantation owner present. When pushed to their breaking point, enslaved people were capable of solidarity that transcended individual self-preservation. The implications extended far beyond one escaped murderer. If enslaved communities could coordinate resistance activities this effectively, if they could maintain collective silence under extreme pressure, then the entire system of control that kept hundreds of thousands of people in bondage might be far more fragile than anyone had realized. But Fenridge wasn't finished with his investigation. The failure of physical intimidation simply meant that more extreme measures would be necessary to break the conspiracy of silence that protected Margaret's memory. What he planned for the following morning would test whether human solidarity could survive when the stakes escalated beyond individual suffering to collective destruction. The auction block stood empty in the center of Blackridge Hollow's main yard, its weathered platform casting long shadows across ground that had been watered by 3 days of tears and blood. By August 20th, Mortimer Fenridge had reached a conclusion that would forever alter the lives of 62 human beings who had committed no crime beyond refusing to betray a friend's memory. When interrogation fails to break collective resistance, the final option is collective punishment, designed to ensure that such solidarity never emerges again. The morning air carried the sound of chains being fitted to wagon wheels, the bitter scent of fear sweat mixed with wood smoke, and the rough texture of hemp rope coiled in neat piles beside the auction platform. These sensory anchors marked the beginning of what Fenridge and the assembled plantation owners called necessary measures to restore proper order. Tobias Ravensden had spent the previous evening composing letters to slave dealers in Richmond, Norfolk, and Charleston. The correspondence, written in his careful legal handwriting, advertised the immediate availability of prime field hands and domestic servants, ages ranging from 16 to 55, experienced in tobacco cultivation and household management. The decision to sell the entire enslaved population of Blackridge Hollow represented more than economic calculation. It was a deliberate message to every plantation in Western Virginia about the price of protecting those who dared to raise their hands against white authority. "We cannot allow this conspiracy of silence to stand unchallenged," Ravensden announced to the gathered plantation owners on the morning of August 20th. "If enslaved people believe they can murder their betters and rely on community protection, we'll soon face insurrection across every estate in the Commonwealth." The logic was brutal, but consistent with the legal framework of 1803 Virginia. Since individual interrogation had failed to identify Margaret's accomplices, collective punishment would serve both to recover financial losses and to demonstrate that solidarity with murderers carried consequences extending far beyond personal suffering. Clementine Ashbrook, whose own plantation had contributed searchers to the failed manhunt, voiced what many were thinking. "Selling them all seems extreme, Tobias. Some of these people have worked Blackridge land for 20 years or more." Ravensden's response revealed the cold mathematics that governed enslaved lives in the antebellum South. 20 years of faithful service becomes meaningless the moment they choose loyalty to a murderer over loyalty to their lawful owners. The sale proceeds will cover Sophronia's burial expenses and provide capital for restocking with more reliable labor. Property had no right to choose its loyalties. The auction began at 10 o'clock that morning, conducted by a traveling slave dealer named Marcella Thornbridge, who had arrived from Richmond with wagons, chains, and account books detailing current market prices for human beings in various southern markets. Josiah Bramblewell, still bearing the welts from his interrogation 3 days earlier, was the first to mount the auction block. At 42, he represented skilled labor, a blacksmith whose expertise in metalwork made him valuable to plantation owners needing someone who could repair tools, shoe horses, and fabricate iron implements. Strong back, experienced in all forms of metalwork, Thornbridge announced to the assembled buyers, "Some recent discipline issues, but nothing that proper management can't address." Opening bid at $400. The bidding was brisk, driven partly by Josiah's skills and partly by buyers' awareness that they were purchasing people who had demonstrated dangerous capacity for collective resistance. Several bidders specifically requested that their purchases be transported to Deep South cotton plantations, where isolation and harsher working conditions would discourage any lingering thoughts of solidarity or resistance. Felicity Dunsmore followed Josiah to the block, her kitchen skills and literacy making her attractive to buyers seeking house servants. At 28, she represented prime domestic labor, despite her recent involvement in what the auctioneers carefully termed disciplinary complications. The sale proceeded with mechanical efficiency throughout the morning and into the afternoon. Families that had lived together for decades were separated as individual members were sold to buyers from different states. Children old enough to work were auctioned separately from their parents, their future determined by market forces rather than human relationships. Old Samuel, the 63-year-old field hand who who had quoted scripture during his interrogation, was among the last to be sold. His age made him less valuable for physical labor, but his obvious intelligence and leadership qualities made him dangerous to keep in Virginia. Experienced field supervisor, literate despite lack of formal education, Thornbridge announced. Suitable for training younger workers or overseeing small-scale agricultural operations. Due to age and recent behavioral issues, opening bid at $150. A cotton planter from Georgia purchased Samuel for $200, intending to use him as a driver on a plantation where his capacity for inspiring solidarity among other enslaved people would be carefully monitored and controlled. By sunset on August 20th, the auction had generated $4,700 in gross receipts. After deducting Thornbridge's commission, transportation costs, and other expenses, the net proceeds barely covered the estimated value of Sophronia Blackridge's lost domestic services and the ongoing costs of investigating her murder. But the financial calculations missed the point entirely. The mass sale of Blackridge Hollow's enslaved population was never intended as profitable business transaction. It was designed as a public demonstration of what happened to enslaved communities that dared to protect those who challenged white authority. The empty quarters stood silent as the last wagon departed toward Richmond, carrying human beings who would be scattered across plantations from Georgia to Texas. The fields that had been cultivated by 3 generations of enslaved families lay untended, their tobacco plants beginning to wither in the late summer heat. Most significantly, the main house remained exactly as Margaret had left it on August 15th. The front porch still stained with blood that refused to wash clean, the ruins of Sophronia's rocking chair stacked beside the steps like evidence of a crime that would never be fully adjudicated. Mortimer Fenridge departed Blackridge Hollow 3 days after the auction, having accepted a position managing a larger plantation in South Carolina, where his experience with difficult populations was considered valuable expertise. But as he loaded his belongings onto a wagon bound for Charleston, Fenridge noticed something that troubled him more than he cared to admit. The bloodstains on the front porch had darkened over the past week, and sometimes, when the wind was just right, he could swear he heard the sound of a rocking chair creaking against weathered oak planks. What happened when a place absorbed that much concentrated suffering and rage? And what kind of memory would linger in the mountains long after everyone who witnessed Margaret's rebellion had died or moved away? The Blackridge Hollow main house stands empty today, its broken windows staring across fields gone wild with Virginia creeper and sumac. But locals claim that on certain August afternoons, when the mountain fog rolls thick through the hollow, you can still hear the sound of a rocking chair creaking on the front porch. This is how personal rebellion transforms into legend, when the living witnesses disappear, but the place itself refuses to forget what happened within its boundaries. The sound of wind through broken shutters, the musty scent of abandoned rooms, the texture of paint peeling from clapboard siding. These anchors mark what remains of a plantation that once housed over 60 human beings, but now shelters only memories and the occasional trespasser drawn by stories that have grown, more elaborate with each telling. After the mass auction of August 1803, Blackridge Hollow changed hands 3 times in rapid succession. Each new owner arrived with plans to restore the plantation to profitability, and each departed within 2 years, citing everything from soil exhaustion to transportation difficulties. But the real reason was always the same. No one could live comfortably in a house where the front porch still bore stains that refused to fade, no matter how many times they were scrubbed. The Ravensden family purchased the property in 1805, intending to use it as a summer retreat from their main plantation near Richmond. Tobias Ravensden's wife, Verity, supervised the installation of new furnishings and a complete renovation of the main house. But the project was abandoned after workmen reported hearing voices from empty rooms and tools, mysteriously moving from where they'd been placed. Most disturbing of all were the reports from Verity herself. She claimed that whenever she sat on the front porch, even in a different chair, positioned in a different location, she would hear what sounded like someone humming a work song, the kind of melody that enslaved people sang to coordinate their labor in tobacco fields. "It's not threatening," she confided to her sister Leonora Whitcomb during one of their afternoon visits, "but it's persistent, like someone trying to remind me of something I'm supposed to remember." The Ashbrook family took ownership in 1807, but their tenure lasted only 18 months. Clementine Ashbrook, who had witnessed the original auction, found herself unable to sleep in the master bedroom. She reported dreams of dozens of people standing in the front yard, all of them watching the house in silence. "They're not angry," she wrote to a cousin in Charleston. "They're just waiting, as if they expect something to happen that hasn't happened yet." By 1810, Blackridge Hollow had gained a reputation throughout Western Virginia as a property that couldn't be successfully occupied. Local folklore began to develop around the abandoned plantation, with stories that grew more elaborate as they passed from neighbor to neighbor, generation to generation. The most persistent tale concerned the rocking chair that had been destroyed in Margaret's final act of rebellion. Despite being reduced to splinters and kindling, locals claimed that the chair had somehow reassembled itself on the front porch. Travelers passing through the hollow reported seeing a woman sitting in it during the late afternoon hours, always rocking slowly, always humming the same wordless melody. Some chairs remembered their purpose. The legend took on additional details. As decades passed, Margaret was described as continuing her eternal afternoon of mending, still performing the domestic tasks that had been assigned to her in life. But now the work was voluntary rather than coerced, and the humming that accompanied it carried notes of satisfaction rather than resignation. More significantly, the story suggested that Margaret's spirit served as a guardian for other enslaved people seeking freedom. The Underground Railroad routes that had facilitated her escape allegedly remained active, with runaway slaves reporting encounters with a woman who appeared at crucial moments to point them toward safe houses or warn them away from danger. A diary found in the effects of a Quaker abolitionist named Josiah Bramblewell, possibly a descendant of the blacksmith sold at the Blackridge auction, contained this entry from 1837. "The colored folks speak of a woman in the Virginia mountains who helps the fleeing find their way north. They call her the rocking chair lady and say she never rests because her work isn't finished." The Civil War brought changes to Western Virginia, including the abolition of slavery that made Margaret's rebellion historically obsolete. But the legend persisted, evolving to incorporate new elements that reflected changing times while maintaining its core narrative of resistance and justice. During Reconstruction, federal investigators examining abandoned plantations for evidence of war crimes reported strange phenomena at Blackridge Hollow. Tools left overnight were found arranged in perfect order by morning. Visitors who camped on the property woke to find their fires rekindled and their food supplies mysteriously replenished. Most remarkably, several investigators reported hearing conversations between multiple voices speaking from the direction of the old slave quarters, despite the fact that the buildings had been empty for decades. By the early 1900s, Blackridge Hollow had become a destination for curiosity seekers drawn by stories of ghostly encounters and supernatural phenomena. Local guides would lead groups through the ruins, pointing out the bloodstains on the front porch that remained visible despite 70 years of weather and neglect. The most common experience reported by visitors was auditory, the sound of a rocking chair creaking against wooden planks, accompanied by humming that seemed to emanate from multiple voices harmonizing in complex, beautiful patterns reminiscent of work songs and spirituals. But perhaps the most significant aspect of the Blackridge Hollow legend was its function as a form of historical memory. In a region where the official records of slavery focused on economic statistics and legal frameworks, the ghost stories preserved the emotional and psychological reality of what had occurred within the plantation system. Margaret's rebellion, transformed through decades of retelling into a supernatural narrative, became a way for communities to discuss the violence and resistance that had shaped their landscape without directly confronting the political implications of that history. The story suggested that some acts of rebellion create echoes that outlast the original participants, that places can absorb the moral weight of what happens within their boundaries, and that justice delayed might still, eventually, find expression. Today, Blackridge Hollow remains accessible to hikers willing to follow unmarked trails through Virginia's Blue Ridge Mountains. The main house is structurally unsound, but the front porch still stands, supporting what locals claim is the same rocking chair that Sophronia Blackridge died in over 2 centuries ago. Park rangers report that the chair appears to move position between visits, despite the absence of any human intervention. And acoustic experts have recorded unexplained sounds emanating from the abandoned property during late afternoon hours in August. Whether these phenomena represent genuine supernatural activity or the power of suggestion operating on visitors primed by folklore, the legend of Margaret and her eternal rocking chair continues to attract people seeking connection with stories of resistance that traditional history books tend to minimize or ignore. The Blackridge Hollow ghost tale serves as unofficial monument to 63 human beings whose names appear in no official memorials, whose suffering generated wealth that built mansions and educated children, whose rebellion against oppression transformed them from historical footnotes into legends that refuse to die. And sometimes, late on August afternoons, when the mountain mist rolls thick through the hollow, visitors still report hearing the sound of humming carried on the wind, not angry or mournful, but satisfied, as if someone who had waited a very long time for justice was finally peacefully at rest. Local mountain folk whisper that Margaret's spirit still rocks on that porch every August 15th, humming work songs while she mends the torn fabric of memory itself. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.